something that's in the library here or in the archives here? Do students who come to this university actually know that tradition? Is it in the classroom? Is it part of the culture? We'll talk about what the bishops ought to do, I'm sure. We can also talk about what you need to do. It's also the right time. I was very struck and moved by the beatification of Pope John Paul II, but I was very concerned. They seemed to turn this tough Polish prophet guy into sort of a soft, holy person who handled suffering well. And he did handle suffering and death well, but they talked about how he helped bring communism down. Almost no one mentioned that the instrument for bringing down communism was not tanks, was not an encyclical, it was a labor union. And the alliance between the Holy Father and Solidarity went basically uncommented upon. I'm very struck by this group of priests and young people who call themselves the John Paul II generation. I admire that and admire them. I wonder whether they really know John Paul II and whether they really know his defense of labor unions is indispensable and his commitment to economic justice, and why every time he went to some place he found some time in the schedule to meet with workers. So we've had a lot of rich stuff today. I'm going to talk a little bit as a practitioner. What I'm going to try and do is talk a little bit about what has changed and what has not, reflections on a little bit of the relationship between labor and the church at our level, a suggestion of what a larger framework might offer, one example of how we try to practice what we preach, and I'll close, if time permits, with some directions and dangers for our relationship. My comments are more personal than professional. Candidly, two of the most important institutions in my life are the Roman Catholic Church and the labor movement. I work for one and I admire the other. When I grew up, two things were clear. You didn't eat meat on Friday and you never crossed the picket line. Well, I eat meat on Friday, but I still don't cross picket lines. It was a part of the culture. It was a part of who we were. The beatification and the focus on the Pope and Pope John Paul in Poland brought back a story for me. I remember when I first started at the Bishops' Conference, Lech Walesa came to visit us, and it was an amazing visit. It was a gray November day. We had Mass together. We had breakfast. I've never had Polish sausage and onions for breakfast before, but it was worth it. And we had a chance to talk to him. He said, I want to thank every priest, every bishop, every Catholic in America for your support of Solidarity. And because of my job, I had to respond. And I said, Mr. President, your cause was just, your leadership was inspiring. Everyone supported Solidarity. It wasn't hard. And he looked at me and said, no. I don't know. It's the only word of English he spoke. I don't know. It was no in Poland. But he said no. In the beginning, when it mattered, all we could count on is the church and the labor movement. And that made all the difference. So when we get our act together, we can make a difference. The dilemma is we're having a hard time getting our act together. The two institutions I referenced that I really care about, I think are in trouble. I think are in trouble in similar ways. They're very different. One is a religious institution, the other is a workers' organization. But they're both losing members. They're both beset by divisions. They're both under attack in different ways. I think they both struggle to pass on history and tradition and leadership to a new generation. I think the labor movement is actually doing better. I think we're both challenged by the reality of immigration. It offers great hope, but enormous challenge, because those could be our future members. But if we don't respond creatively and effectively, we will lose that opportunity. They are hierarchical in a different way. I remember there was a meeting of bishops and union presidents, and except for the suits, you couldn't tell them apart. You know, they were all white, older, Irish, mostly, balding, sort of looked like me, men. Well, the labor movement has done a better job of reflecting the diversity of our country than we have, but the reality is some of them have wives and children, and we hope the others didn't, but there was something about the fact that the culture, a common culture, brought us together. And I think that is there, but it's different. And we have to do a lot more to build relationships. We have similar assets, even though we have these troubles. We have a set of principles and values. We have a lot of experience. We have members, we have leaders, we have institutions. And the question is, how will we use those to advance the mission we hold in common? I think some things have not changed. I still think one of the most countercultural things the church teaches is not that all life is sacred. It is not that the poor ought to come first. It is not that war ought to be a last resort, although those things are still countercultural. It is that unions are a good thing. Not only in Poland, not only decades ago, but here and now. Our church is a lot of things. It is not trendy. We don't make it up as we go along. And I would argue the church's tradition is stronger, more clear now than it was 120 years ago. I know everybody says Rerum Novarum was great to read. It wasn't that easy to read. The first time I encountered Rerum Novarum was in high school, where they used those sentences to diagram in English class because they were so complicated. I frankly think Benedict is a lot more clear. While he says man a lot, he doesn't say it as much as Leo XIII did. We still have a problem to communicate. I think that has a lot to do with what we've been talking about through the day. We think 40-page encyclicals apparently is the way to deliver the message. And what are tweets? 130 words were not there. What? Characters. Oh, hell, maybe we can do that. No. I would suggest that one of the challenges is that, and I don't want this in the paper, Jerry, that the church's support for labor was not only theological or philosophical, it was linked to class, ethnicity, geography, in fact, identity. A lot of our bishops, a lot of us came from working class and immigrant families, and it was just a part of who we were. That's not the case anymore. And so for a lot of other people, this is a tradition that has to be learned. This is an engagement that has to be experienced. I remember I worked for Cardinal Hickey, and we had a meeting. We had one of those union-only construction policies, and the pastors were complaining. And they said it costs too much. It made the developers in the parish mad. That was one set of arguments. Frankly, there were another set of arguments that the building trades in Washington were not very integrated, were not very diverse. One of the arguments was that they gave their adversaries better deals than they gave their friends. They would make concessions for the people who didn't want to use union labor. And we went around the table with all the diocesan big shots, and it was 13-2 for changing the policy. And I was 1, and the cardinal was 2. and we won. You know, I like to say it's not a democracy. That cultural thing where it's just a part of who we are. I don't think Jerry remembers when the Holy Father was coming to Baltimore, there was an informational picket line up in front of the hotel where the bishops were going to stay. And this was a big problem. And people went back and forth, and how about this, and how about that? You know what settled it? 8 tickets to the papal mass. I don't think that would work now, maybe. But my point is that the principles are as strong as ever, but the realities are a lot more complicated, and the work is a lot more challenging. But when Pope Benedict says that trade unions are more important than ever in this context, he is not whistling. People say, why doesn't the church speak out? 2 out of 3 encyclicals are powerful social encyclicals. I don't know about you, but I did not expect that from Pope Benedict. I think the church is speaking out. I think our bishops are speaking out about Wisconsin, about the budget, about a lot of other things. But we have not found a way to be heard in a lot of these things. A couple challenges that I think we need to communicate more clearly, and then I'll wrap up. I think we have to be clear that trade unions, for the church and for the labor movement, are more than a means to get more. They're a means for workers to be more, to have a voice, to participate, respect, as Cleet said. I think we have a big problem, and people have referred to it, around the polarization of our society and the partisan divides in our society and the way that plays out when you have a Republican Party that almost by definition is hostile to the labor movement, and a Democratic Party that, frankly, in my view, gives lip service most of the time, but it supports the labor movement. Then you get a situation where some of the concerns the Holy Father and others have expressed about the politicization of labor are true, or at least can be used to undermine support. Somehow, we have to make clear that what we're about together is defending human life and dignity, work, and workers. The other thing is there seems to be a change, and it was Jerry Shea, I think, who mentioned this to me, is it used to be that other workers aspired to have what union workers had: good wages, pensions, decent health care. Now, for a variety of reasons, a lot of workers resent what union workers have because they don't have it, and they don't think they're going to get it. And when it's public workers, they're saying, I have to pay for that. I don't think there are many people, and this may be sad, that wake up in the morning and say, how can I help the labor movement do its job today? Or how can I help the Bishops' Conference do its job today? There's some evidence that even the people who work at the Bishops' Conference don't wake up and say that. What people want is a decent living, a way to raise their families, an economy that takes care of the poor and vulnerable and workers. And on your table is an effort to try and summarize Catholic teaching in really a holy card. Somebody said, forget about the 120-page encyclical. If we could fit this on a holy card, we'd really have something. Well, this is the holy card version of 120 years of Catholic social teaching. David Bonnier, who many people in the room used to carry this around in his pocket and used to pull it out and talk to people on the floor of the house. I think putting this in a moral framework, John Paul II said, the market needs a moral framework. The question is, what is the moral framework? I think this offers the elements of a moral framework, including the right to organize. The key sentence for me is on the back. The Catholic tradition, this is a quote from John Paul II, calls for a society of work, enterprise, and participation, which is not directed against the market, but demands that the market be appropriately controlled by the forces of society and by the state to assure that the basic needs of the whole society are satisfied. I think that's a good description of what we have not had. The other piece that is on your table is an effort to practice what we preach. Somebody mentioned, what about hospitals? Terrible conflict, particularly on the West Coast, between hospitals and unions that represent hospital workers. The leadership of the labor movement of the Catholic Health Association and the Bishops' Conference, John Sweeney, Sister Carol, Cardinal McCarrick, entered into a very long process of dialogue to try and come up with an alternative to the status quo that emphasized that it was up to workers, not organizers, not hospital administrators, not bishops, whether and how they would be represented. In conclusion, relationships matter. I think a big part of the problem is that at the local level, labor leaders don't know bishops and pastors and bishops don't know labor leaders. We need to build bridges. 10% of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development resources, $1 million, go to worker associations along the lines that Kathy did. I think showing up, someone said, how come I never hear anyone preach about this? Go to the Labor Day Mass at the National Shrine every year, and you'll hear Cardinal Wuerl preach about this. We need to resist polarization in our church. We can divide up the work, but we should not divide up the church. Let's not pit our movement against other movements. Where we can cooperate, I think, is defending the poor in this budget process. One party is targeting the poor, and the other party seems to be silent on the poor. We ought to be their advocate. We need to focus on jobs and workers because very few people are talking about that agenda. And immigration reform, while it seems off in the distance, is the only way forward that will not lead to continued exploitation of workers, both native and those who just got here. We need to respect our differences in terms of our identity, our purpose, our mission, our culture, our language. We should not be interfering with our own internal affairs. We ought to be very careful about sort of trying to pull people into our overarching agenda. We need to respect. The labor movement has a particular mission. The church has a mission. And I would warn, there is an effort on the left, frankly, to say this is all one cause. It begins with abortion on demand, the redefinition of family, and eventually you'll get to economic justice and workers and other things. That's not my experience, but that will make cooperation difficult. Likewise, the church cannot insist that the labor movement get involved on our side of those issues. In conclusion, I was at a session, I think Jerry and John were there, and it was after Monsignor Higgins died. And the question was, where is the church in the labor movement? Where is the next Monsignor Higgins? And we talked for a while, and what occurred to me is John Sweeney is the church in the labor movement. Jerry Shea is the church in the labor. I'm the church with the labor movement. Father is the church. That all of us are going to have to fulfill that legacy. That there may be times for chaplains, but for most of us in the aftermath of Vatican II, it will be lay people who pick up the challenge to defend human life and dignity, to make the case for the dignity of work and the rights of workers. And that was good work 120 years ago, and it's a really important task today. Thank you.
It's been a long and glorious day. I think I'm willing to forego my closing comments, given the extraordinary richness of all of the discussions that have taken place. But could I ask that if there are some questions, this is, I think, what my closing comments were going to be about is what should we do next? What's next after this gathering together to commemorate Rerum Novarum and its connections to our time? if I could ask you all to think before you come to the microphone about that question and maybe pose some questions to the panel on that topic, I think that would be a wonderful way to bring things to a conclusion this afternoon.
My name is Sister Marie Lucy, and I work with the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. Excuse me. I don't think I'm going to directly answer your question, but it's part of it, I think. I just wanted to throw the spotlight for a moment on something that was kind of running through a lot of the, thank you, panelists, but was never surfaced directly, and that is gender issues in the labor movement. And Kathy talked about long-term workers. Cletus talked about the housekeepers, predominantly women in these occupations. We know that in our country that women are still paid less for comparable work that men are doing, excuse me, and that I had read an article in the Post recently that there are fewer women entering the workforce, and one of the reasons is because they are not paid sufficiently for child care to be able to provide child care, and so fewer women are entering the workforce. So do you think that the labor movement and the church are doing enough right now to address the gender issues in this larger issue?
I think that your point's well taken. It's not just gender issues, but low-income gender issues. And if you look at the whole issue of poverty, it's a woman's issue. I mean, the women at the end of their lives and who have less economic security, women who are working, as we talked about, the domestic workers, the long-term care workers, and a lot of them are immigrant workers as well, which puts them kind of with the double-edged sword there. So I think that the church has been strong about that, can certainly do a better job. I think the unions have been strong about that and can do a better job. And that might be, too, a little bit of where John was talking about, where we can build some bridges. I mean, these are also the women who are in the parishes and who are doing parish council and who are running the PTAs and taking care of the churches as well and the schools. So I think that there's been some good history there, but can certainly be improved upon.
Just add this from my observations in organized labor at the moment. I think diversity in general has been a terrific challenge. And depending on the union, the particular union, you'll see a more effective commitment to that than others. The hotel workers union, Unite here, that I'm more associated with at the moment, I see an increasing number of, first of all, the housekeepers make up a large section of that union, but also in the leadership levels for the locals. We're seeing more and more women taking those positions, and I would imagine in the not distant future at the international level that you would see some change there. But there is a long way to go for some other unions. Still, the idea of diversity is, well, they came from another part of Ireland or another part of Italy, and so I think there's a commitment because that's where the future is, or it's going to die.
Yeah, my name is Li Yang. I want to thank all the panelists, your time and effort. But I would like to contribute some of my point that you should take into account. First is, I think you see those laborers that try to spend so much time and years and decades just try to raise 1 penny a pound of tomatoes, and just think about it. If whatever you do, all the efforts compared to like 1 traffic ticket, even you didn't violate any traffic law. 1 ticket, and then now it's not $7.25 $75. Now they have a all long list of fine, although it's not according to their code, but that's what they did. So you are not able to pay several $100s of violation, which you didn't even violate. The problem now is that you have all these health agencies, Department of Justice, or even White House. You send them a message, you send them a complaint, they never respond. And now if you have all these complaints, and you want them to resolve it, they didn't resolve it according to the existing law. They always say we must have a new law. Once you have a new law, what you did is to send them hundreds of millions of dollars to support most personnel or agencies or new agencies or national securities. So what I've tried to say is that you have to redirect those money to solve the real problem using the existing law first. And using the complaint or citizens' input, see how they identify. So you have to have a White House, you have to have a labor union, bring them together, what the laborers real say, what the citizens real say, and put them together. And this forum is good because you will allow people to talk, but if you go to the county council or go to the city mayor's office, general assembly, they will not allow you to speak. Instead, they will abduct you and maybe send you or dump you somewhere. So I just really think we have to work effectively, direct the resource to our youth, not try to send the resource to other agencies. We must resolve all the complaint issues, and we have to really open up, improve the democracy and fair election process, because currently now we don't have a fair election process.
Well, I think one of the issues you raised, is with the Coalition of Immokalee workers and working so hard just to get a pound raise on their tomatoes. And, that was just kind of the beginning of the story, which one was getting their wages. Part of it a lot was getting the respect and having the growers acknowledge them. But they also did their community organizing. I went to Immokalee, the conditions in which they were living in trailers that were falling apart with no air conditioning. And this isn't the breezy Florida beaches that were there. This is Central Florida. And the conditions, and they also uncovered conditions of slavery and got that stopped. So a lot of what they were doing was just fighting for their survival.
I know, but that's my point. I appreciate what you say, and I take those into account. What I say is you didn't direct the resources to help low income. Instead, you send it to the bank and financial institution.
Catholic Campaign for Human Development has been funding Coalition of Immokalee workers for over the last 10, 15 years.
You can have set up different agencies, but you didn't really solve the problem. The problem is there are some officials or there are somebody who killed our citizens. You don't really resolve, send them to jail. Instead, you send the non-violence or non-violation of the law to the jail or to mental hospital. And you use all those money, they charge the veterans $700 or $1,000 a day, or you charge to the government $700,000 a day, plus they give you the forced medication.
I think you're raising a number of really interesting points, and I would be delighted actually to take your comments and to pass them along. So if you could meet with me afterwards, I'd be glad to talk with you. And I think that I'll do what I can to help you with some of these things.
Right. We are working for the laborers. We want the benefit to the laborers or low income rather than they change the water without changing the medicine.
Completely. I'd be delighted to talk with you about it. Thank you very much.
My name is Rudy Oswald, and I commend the panel for their work today. In terms of carrying it out, I'd like to take John's comment about his prayer card, and maybe we could take that prayer card and try and put it into every bulletin in a different way. I'd like to highlight the budget issue. I serve on a commission of the aging for Montgomery County, and we tried to highlight the 2011 budget cuts by saying that the training for senior citizens in terms of job training was being cut by 50%. We were saying that that budget compromise, quote, $38 billion, meant that half of the people who are getting energy assistance to keep their house warm were not going to get it. That money that was going for community programs meant that there would no longer be a grandparents program. I think if the letter that was in detail that the Catholic bishops sent that does not talk about amorphous budget cuts, that does not talk about these things in generalities, that we need to reach people to understand that this commitment for the poor means these specific cuts that are being enacted, and that the people understand, and that they be disseminated to the best way that we can.
Rudy, first of all, thank you. People don't know Rudy. Rudy, for decades, was sort of thought for the rest of us and analyzed things as director of research. For you to be saying we got to put this into English is a good lesson. I remember giving a talk in upstate New York, and at the end, I thought it had gone really well, but I went to sit down, and this guy was really angry with me. And unfortunately, he was the president of the group, and I was seated next to him. And I said, you're angry. And what's the problem? And he goes, you don't want to know. And by then, I didn't, you know. He said, I'm tired of all this talk about encyclicals and Matthew 25 and the unborn and the undocumented and all that. What about me? What about people like me who pay the bills and pay taxes, use my envelope? And I responded with great eloquence about John Paul II, and I would have told him about Benedict if it had happened now. And I was getting nowhere. Finally, I said, what do you do for a living? He said, I'm a lawyer. He was a big deal partner in one of the major law firms. I said, you say you work really hard. Do you ever see the person who cleans your office? He goes, what do you mean? I said, well, somebody dusts the desk, somebody scrubs the toilet. He said, yeah, what? I said, what do you pay her? He said, well, we don't pay her. We hire a firm, they hire her. He said, well, I said, come on, what do you pay her? He said, probably minimum wage. I said, does your firm have a health plan? He says, yes, a good one. It covers families. I said, can she take her kids to the doctor when she gets sick? He said, well, no, she's not a part of our plan. He says, what are you getting at? I said, well, what I'm getting at is this is not about liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat. This is about whether the woman who cleans your office, whether she can take her kids to the doctor when they get sick. And he said, well, why didn't you say so? I think part of the challenge for us is we have to say so in a way that people can hear it.
You said it better than I did.
My name is Bob Stewart. I worked most of my life to age 67 and retired, and now I'm an Ignatian volunteer. And I work with John Horsch over here for Social Action Linking Together, and also at the Center of Concern. I volunteer there. And for about 10 years, I was the chairperson of the Justice and Peace Commission, all gratis, for the Diocese of Belleville in Southern Illinois. Things you could do. I have a couple of suggestions. One thing we're doing at the Center of Concern, which I think is a good way to go, we need to use film, and we need to use books or literature to help explain Catholic social teaching. Let me give you an example. The movie, Under the Same Moon, to me, that communicated the problems of immigrants better than anything I've ever seen, read, or what. You know, we need to take those films like that and start talking about how this connects with Catholic social teaching. The other one is example of book. John Grisham's latest book on the confession. If you're not anti-capital punishment after reading that, then you weren't very open to any suggestions. Sometimes, and I like the idea of the suggestion, the Holy Card, okay? But I think in many dioceses, Catholics are brought with understanding that Catholic social teaching is optional. I know when my friend John, who's worked with legislators in state of Virginia for many, many years. I just come on lately. Is, you know, when he talks about social justice, Catholic social teaching, they said, well, we oppose abortion. And they think that's it. That's the end of it. We have, I won't mention his name, we have a high official in Virginia that's frequently portrayed in the Catholic newspaper as being pro-life. Well, he doesn't support, he doesn't, you know, he's not against the death penalty. He doesn't support the bishops when it comes to immigration. I guess what I'm saying is on Catholic social teaching, we need to look for ways to give it some sizzle. and I think film and I think literature or books is a way to possibly do that. That's just a suggestion. Yeah.
Thanks. My name is Ben Palumbo, and I want to compliment the panel for really a very, very interesting couple of hours. I have a very soft spot in my heart for immigrants, and I was touched by what John Sweeney said about his parents. My paternal grandfather arrived in 1890, and he went to work for Necco, which was the New England Confectionery Corporation, as a candy maker. Two of his sons attended Boston College. Another uncle of mine attended Boston College. My godfather attended Boston College. All of them were children of blue-collar immigrants. Boston College was a place where the children of Italian-American, or Italian, I should say, and Irish immigrants, Catholics all, their children could go to Boston College and get an education. Today, we know to go to Boston College, you have to have $50,000 a year minimum in your pocket. One of my sons went to St. Joseph's in Philadelphia. Same situation. The children of Italian Catholic immigrants, Irish Catholic immigrants could go years ago to St. Joseph's. Today, $40,000 may get you a year at St. Joseph's. My question is, what is the church doing to provide higher education such as was provided for the children of the immigrants of the 1890s and early part of the 20th century, to provide higher education for the Catholic immigrants' children today?
Everyone's looking at me. Well, you know, I think that you're making an extremely important point, Ben. Catholic universities across the country, you know, really don't have the kinds of resources, you know, to be able to provide low-cost university education, you know, to the number of students that they have. Most of them are tuition-dependent institutions that only exist because of the constant inflow of the tuition dollars, the dollars that pay professor salaries and so on and so forth. For Catholic institutions, higher education institutions, to be, you know, competitive, they have to go after the same kinds of professors and have the same kinds of facilities and have the same kinds of laboratories as non-Catholic universities. So Catholic universities, in other words, aren't in a different universe than all of the other universities in the United States. I mean, they're all caught up in this the same situation. And there's really no mechanism, you know, that I can think of to address this in the short run. It seems to me that all Catholic universities, though, probably have a particular responsibility to bend over backwards to be inclusive and to provide for students who have the capacities but lack the resources, you know, to attend those universities. And my experience is, in fact, that's the case. My experience as somebody who's been involved in Catholic university education since 1984 is that Catholic universities really have a sparkling record in comparison to private universities generally, in reaching out to to students who are less enfranchised than others.
I'd just like to expand that from Catholic colleges and universities to Catholic grammar schools, Catholic high school. I was a pastor in Chicago. We had about 5,000 mostly Mexican immigrants, families in the parish. We had a school, which was large, but 5 brand new public schools in the neighborhood. The parents who sent children to our parish school, both parents worked. Some of them had more than one job. it's just very pricey. I think a very creative thing, Father John Foley, Jesuit, started the Cristo Rey School in that neighborhood, and that was a wonderful model because every one of those kids had a job. They were socialized into the city, and I think we need to look at some creative models like that. Maybe, I obviously can't do jobs for the grammar schools, but certainly for the high schools, because they're also priced out. If you're making minimum wage or not making, even if you're making just a living wage, that frugal wage that Leo talked about, you still probably cannot afford Catholic education without scholarships or grants of some kind. So I think we have to be creative. I do want to highlight the Cristo Rey schools, a wonderful model.
I have
Just
a follow-up question to Mr.
Quick
Carr.
comment, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to ask if this is an item on the agenda for the bishops.
I'm not sure. I'm like you. I said to one of my Jesuit friends, the way the Jesuits practice the option for the poor is by making me poor, because I pay those tuition bills. I assume there is, but frankly, this is something that really is got to be dealt with within the Catholic higher education community. There's a lot of talk about identity between bishops and university leaders. It'd be great if part of the identity were who we serve and what we teach in terms of Catholic social teaching. One of the challenges is to make sure that if you find a way to get young people in these schools, I'm somebody who's a product of it and invested in it and consider it the best thing we've ever done. My daughter's in Teach for America because of the good education she got and the values that Loyola advanced for her. But don't look to the bishops to help Catholic education discover its mission and identity. I think we have to look to the leaders of Catholic higher education to be clear about mission, identity, and part of that is who they serve and what it costs.
Thank you.
I think this has been a tremendous conference. I just want to thank you, Steve. This was really terrific. My name is Steve Kruger. I'm the national director of an organization called Catholic Democrats, and our mission is to advance the rich tradition of Catholic social teaching in the public square and within the Democratic Party. As some of you might imagine, from time to time, we have been questioned as to our Catholic authenticity because of certain positions with respect to some of the culture issues. I'm not here to talk about those, but I am here to talk about the challenges of bringing Catholic social teaching into the public square and legislatively in trying to work with the institutional church. A Jesuit at Boston College told me that you have to insinuate yourself into the institutional church if you want to be effective. And I find that that's something I am still trying to learn how to do. And I would like to draw upon the wisdom of our panel to talk to me and to us on this particular issue of the rights of labor and, as John kind of expanded it, to helping the poor. The bishops will be issuing a new voting guide come this November, presumably also to be called Faithful Citizenship. I know that we're hoping that its emphasis will be similar to what it was before, that Catholics should not be single-issue voters. However, we have with us a history from 2008 and 2009 when about 40% of the bishops in total either said you cannot be a good Catholic if you vote for the Democratic candidate, who, by the way, is probably pro-labor, or Barack Obama is anti-Catholic and he should not be invited to the University of Notre Dame. So my question is, how do we collectively, those of us who are pro-labor and want to preserve the rights of labor, encourage our bishops to both speak out on it and to provide a balanced view of Catholic social teaching? Thank you.
I'm sure Others want to jump in on this right away, but I mean, I think part of it is to look at the part one of that document, Forming Consciences, where the bishops call us to bring our faith to the public square rather than bringing our politics to our faith and seeing how that matches up. So I think part of it is the call to us to be involved as faithful citizens. So that's more than just deciding what party we're going to vote for, what candidates we want to vote for, and voting. That means carrying those moral responsibilities, the Catholic social and moral teaching, all 4 years. It's more than just one day. And so, or 2 days if you vote in the primary, you know. And so I think that really being open through prayer, through study, through discussion, through reading, through other discernment, being involved with social justice efforts throughout the 4 years is, and really allowing your conscience to be formed. And then bringing that. So I don't think it's always us looking to the bishops to say, tell us what to do, or make sure you tell my neighbor who I know is going to vote the wrong way to vote the right way. It's about us.
If I could add just a comment or two. The example of Milwaukee, John Sweeney talked about the details of that, and I'm not going to get into that. But lots of people have said to me, I was really glad that Archbishop Wistecki stood up for the rights of workers and that Bishop Blair backed him up. And I said, did you send an email or a letter? And the answer was always no. I said, well, you ought to know everybody, lots of people who disagree with that send emails and letters. I have a lot of them. The right, I don't want to use these categories, but if you want to be heard, you got to speak. And in a lot of ways, the left is left. And those aren't good categories. But when somebody does something you agree with, you ought to be heard. If somebody does something you disagree with, you ought to respectfully let them be heard, because people who have different values and perspectives than you do are working very hard. I am involved with the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, which I think is another great example of the principle of participation and organization. Many of our groups are groups of workers. I know the Catholic community supports us. We get more money than almost any other campaign, but if you were to look at the emails and the letters and the blogs, you would think there is massive, overwhelming opposition to our work. And it's because some people speak up and other people sit back. And this is not a time for people to sit back.
I would just like to respond to Dr. Schneck's invitation to give a response as far as an idea about what to do next. As I've been listening to the panelists, thank you for your presentations, it dawned on me that in the 80s, it was the laborers at the Vatican that petitioned Pope John Paul II to increase their salaries. They didn't have a venue or a forum to bring their labor issues to the Holy Father, because as you can recall, when Rerum Novarum was written, there was no labor forum at the Vatican for labor issues to be voiced. And as Mr. Carr just said, laborers have to speak up. So after many years of working at the Vatican, the laborers at the Vatican finally petitioned the Holy Father to hold the church accountable to its very own teachings, even though at that time the compendium had not been written. So finally, after speaking up and with great conscience of his own responsibilities, Pope John Paul II opened up and finally established a policy and a forum for those laborers at the Vatican to have a means and wherewithal so that their rights as laborers at the very heart of the church could be heard, recognized, and responded to in reality, in practical guidelines. And so as a follow-through to that, what I want to say is it's important for the church to have its policies realized in practical guidelines at the heart of the church. And the labor office of the Apostolic See still does not have, in many ways, if we've ever studied it, an EEO policy, a policy of diversity, a policy for affirmative action for women. We need to have a forum, and we need to look at the labor office of the Apostolic See and talk to those individuals here at a forum where there is a measure of agreement between the intellectual elite and the pastoral proletariat, the people who are seeking the rights. There needs to be a merger of consciousness. And so I would hope that you would put on your agenda to somehow in a conference bring some of those individuals from that office so we could talk to them and maybe speak out about what at the heart of the church could be accomplished so that the compendium of the social doctrine of the church that was written in July 2004 could be rewritten in real time, working practical policies so that it could trickle down into the other dioceses, parishes, universities, so there would be a means for that which is held to be the greatest, one of the greatest books of the compendium, to be put into practice. Thank you.
Kathy, why not? That's what I meant.
Well, I mean, I think one thing too is to look at the Catholic and healthcare document that's on the table, to look at some of the guidelines where labor and Catholic healthcare had this, this dialogue. And this also gives me the opportunity to respond to my own when I was teasing John about the 8 hours and all that, is that the Bishops' Conference is a really good place to work. We get very fair wages. We get a great fringe benefit package, and we have a great boss. And so at least as the USCCB, I think it is a good model.
Get that.
When's my review again?
Yeah.
I forget.
I don't want this to sound as if I'm not interested in the particular issue that provoked your brilliant answer. But that's internal, bureaucratic, really church as structure business. There's another world out here that church is supposed to be related to. And it is related to in a variety of ways. This conference is one of those things. But there's the whole range of structures that are part of the justice and the injustice and the oppression and the unfairness agenda that the vast majority of people in this country are really engaged in. There are people who go to these sorts of conferences and are very focused, and it's very important. But there's this other arena of action that needs really careful diagnosis and then some bits of strategy. Just a couple things came to mind. One is that when we talk about doing something in higher education with a Catholic population, the vast majority of Catholics who are in higher education are not in Catholic schools. So the whole question of developing a competency, a literacy, not only as Father Foley said about theological things like the divinity of Jesus, but about the whole range of things that involve adult, serious understanding of action as a Catholic that has to reach out to a wider universe than those very wealthy students and the persons who are aided, laudably so. But we've got to find ways of reaching out to that wider university population. The other is a whole sense of how is it that so many parts of this Catholic community are disaffiliated, disaffected, are simply not churchgoers. The research that the Institute has done over the years that Dean Hoagie pioneered, reveals that there's just this tremendous lack of engagement in the church. And I think that is a fundamental question that is related to this as well. That is there some way of re-engaging in a very serious way the dimensions of the church that are clearly not attractive to the vast majority of people, perhaps at all times, but in our particular time is the only one that we can worry about. And it seems to me that this is a dimension of this outreach effort to find some fresher ways of communicating more effectively, more clearly, and with the kind of urgency and passion that strikes me is at the heart of all of the wonderful things you've talked about, except for one central problem that struck me as I listened to the White House, your observations. We have a tremendous difficulty in really understanding as the overall population how so many interagency coordinating activities are really related to getting things done. The understandings of bureaucracy have reached profound levels of critique in the United States. That is, the ill-executed national government is a national scandal. It doesn't work. You would not have as much anxiety and anger in a society if some fundamental problem with bureaucracy has in fact gone wrong. And I was struck by the difference in your presentation and the tone of the discussion when other persons were trying to run an office of faith-based activities. The suspicion then, during the Bush years, was that all of these people were involved in some kind of proselytizing for right-wing organizations that were really involved in politicizing church activity. I heard your presentation, and my sense was this is a dimension of bureaucratic activity that talks about legal rights, talks about access, talks about availability, talks about righting wrongs, but is so caught up in the interagency stuff and the direct connection of a community-based group with a government agency. It seems to me we've got to find more intermediating structures that can bridge these things more effectively than the direct connection with Washington. Not that it's not important, but that it seems to me we've got to rethink how we talk about the public service engagement with the community, with the private sector, with the union sector, in ways that re-energize some of the purposes that got us into the bureaucratic frame that we're in now. And I think the diagnosis of that and the three other items I had on my mind are part of an agenda of clarification that is needed before we can see very direct action steps. But I really enjoyed listening to all of the observations, and I've learned a lot today. Thank you.
I'd like to respond maybe to the first part of your comments there, that there's this world out there that is hungry for some of this. And I'd like to offer three target groups. I find when I go to meetings of immigrant workers, and first, you kind of arrive, this is something of an icon, and they look at you like the cavalry has arrived, and you're telling them, do you know the church has been teaching for over 100 years you have a right to have a union, you have a right to do this. They never heard before. So that's one group. For the last 4 years, I did a lot of work on Capitol Hill with members of Congress, both parties, and this kind of goes to Steve's question. I found that for members of Congress, they have to deal with not just writing laws, government regulations, but some of the issues that they step into are serious moral issues, moral dilemmas. When I listen to Catholic members of Congress, either party, and they talk about their background, they'll say, well, the good Jesuits taught me, and they're talking about high school. Or they'll say, the good sisters taught me, and they're talking about grammar school. And if that is the level of religious formation for folks who have to make incredibly serious decisions, it seems to me we have a lot of work to do. The third group would be labor leaders. We have done an excellent job of doing the moral analysis on workers' rights, and most labor leaders get that. And if that were the only conversation with the bishops, for example, and labor leaders, it'd be terrific. it's when labor leaders then also have to make other kinds of political decisions. The moral analysis hasn't been done. And no one's engaging it. I didn't find anybody engaging anybody on Capitol Hill. There's no Catholic campus ministry there. There are other ministries there, but there's no Catholic campus ministry on Capitol Hill. My point in this is that for that world out there, if we're an evangelizing church, we're not evangelizing our Catholic political leaders of either party. And then we hold them accountable for something we've never taught them, or which they partially understand. Or our labor leaders, we will hold them accountable for something for which we've never really done anything other than the labor or the worker analysis. And with our immigrants, most have had limited, if any, religious formation at all. But they have an inner sense. They kind of know right from wrong on these things, but they're just delighted to hear that they belong to a church that has this tradition and is with them and is behind them. So I think we have a lot of work to do in those areas. And Steve, that was kind of one of the ways, it's Steve, right? Yeah, that I would answer. I think we have some obligations, and we don't meet that obligation by saying, I'm not gonna greet you in church. I'm not gonna talk to you. You go over there, don't come in here. How does that allow us to evangelize? How does that engage? And I think a lot of what we've been talking about here today is being willing to engage and talk.
I just want to respond to the last question or point about sort of the bureaucratic barriers or articulation. And so I learned my lesson, I'll say interagency and department less, and speak to the programs more. And I think I just didn't feel I had the time to burrow down deeper into the content of the programs like job clubs, which are, a grassroots nonprofit enterprise that the Department of Labor Center is an open door and a linkage to the public workforce system. So I don't know if that's bureaucratic as much as, yeah, I mean, our centers, but all of our centers and our whole initiative tries to be an open door to say, here we are, government, we need the participation and partnership of grassroots community faith-based organizations to succeed in solving these challenges at the most local level. So we're attempting to sort of break through that bureaucratic, mist. But I think, I'll give you the copy I have here of this partnership guide, but it does, I think, get beyond the sort of the structure into the actual content of partnerships. So.
Last question.
This will be a first. Excuse me, my name is actually Mary Alice Heretic.
Oh.
Yep, Heretic spelled C-K instead of just a plain C. We're not sure who went bad during the Middle Ages, but somebody in the Heretic family obviously did something they shouldn't have done. I appreciate you all hosting this today, and it's been incredibly informative for me. And I think that your question about how do we wrap things up and where do we go from here, and this is the way that I see it as I sit here today. There's a couple of things. There's I as the individual, I as the Catholic, and myself as the labor union person. What some of the context I guess I've gotten out of here today in terms of I as an individual, I heard Catholic Democrats and CatholicLabor.org. Certainly I'll sign up for both of those. My question is, what can I as an individual do with the Catholic Church to bring more labor issues into what my priests talk about on a Sunday morning? What can I do in my local parish? And likewise, what can I as a Catholic do to bring more knowledge to union members so that union members who are going through all these daily battles, so that they understand that the Catholic Church really does support them. So I'm looking for just some outlets and maybe some organizations that maybe I can join it. I'm going to sit down and take notes. Thank you.
One organization I would suggest you talk to, and Tom Schellebarger's here, and Paul is also here, from Interfaith Worker Justice, which has a number of materials for congregations to use. It can also put you in touch with interfaith groups in a particular area, and where you can actually do the kind of analysis, what's happening in a local town with workers, and you begin to do that analysis, and then you'll know what to do next. And you do it at the level of your parish congregation. That's one.
One of the paradoxes for me of the council was it really lifted up the role of lay people, not as ministers of the church or as bureaucrats within the church, but as the people of God. And as a result of the council, or maybe it was coincidence, all the lay organizations have fallen on difficult times. Some have disappeared and others are limping along. So one question would be, as somebody who works for the hierarchy, would be how can we revitalize the sense of lay participation and leadership where lay people speak for themselves? I figure when they fire me, that's what I want to work on. But there is a certain irony. I mean, whether it's on the right or the left or whatever, it is really hard to sustain a consistent lay voice. I see some people, we got to have caucuses in both political parties around human life and dignity that help people stand against, you know, the pressures to follow the party instead of their conscience. We got to have within the labor movement and frankly within the business community places where people can go and talk about how tough it is at some points to hold these things together. And that, I think, was what the council was supposed to promote, and somehow we got lost in something else. And there's a wonderful little piece I think that could be useful. It's one of the best things I think the bishops did, called Everyday Christianity, which really makes the case that it's how we live our faith every day in our families, in our work, in our associations, in our community, that it's how we save our souls, to use the old language. But one of the great things that's out there, and it's very demanding, is Just Faith, which asks for weeks and weeks and weeks of formation and discussion. But tens of thousands of people have grabbed onto that. So there are lots of other things at the parish level. My parish is doing Bible study in a new way that is more focused on people's lives. And so mostly I'm sharing my frustration and my concern about the paradox that the council empowered the laity and the instruments seem to wither away.
Well, thank you all very much. 120 years ago, 1891 in May, Rerum Novarum was released, and it's changed the world dramatically, and as we've heard this afternoon, it's continuing to change the world. Thank you all very much for your attendance. Very much appreciated. We'll do something again, I promise.
Yeah, okay. The time is coming up. I don't know what they're going to do. Good, I gotta go.
Yeah.
My cell phone, right? Yeah.
Oh, it's a terrific idea. I think that's a terrific idea.
Okay, good. You have my cell phone? Yeah.
All right, I'll try to organize.
Yeah, okay.
Think about how to do that. I think that's a great idea. You probably should do it sooner rather than later. Yeah. I think that's a great idea. Well, maybe some kind of a list or something. I'll noodle on it. Yeah, it's a great idea, Gail. Hey, Ben.
Hi, how are you?
This morning, the whole thing really was, I'm very pleased with it. Really. Thanks for coming, Ben. Oh, okay, great.
You know Kathy?
Let me, one quick reminder. No, that's all right. Everything okay? It was great. Figured it out. I mean, it was difficult to kind of do it across the room. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
doing great.
Great job, Kathy.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you
I
so
think
much.